morning, everybody. We'll kick off. This is the first event of the new season for our newly rebranded Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division of Engineers Ireland. So we're very excited to start the season off with a great lecture from Paul. And I guess we've rebranded to include the climate action in our remit based on the fact that, you know, the world has changed, I guess, since this time last year. If you'd said to me we were going to have a 70% renewable electricity target, I would have said no way. So things have changed. We've got a climate action plan. We've got a 70% target. And I guess it's time for us as engineers to start thinking through the hard work that needs to be done to get us there. I'd also just like to just welcome anyone who's joining us on the live stream, and hopefully you can hear and see everything. If you have some questions that you want to submit, please send them to engineerswebcast@gmail.com, and we'll take those at the end. So Paul Blount is Portfolio Director at Quilcha since the start of this year. Prior to that, he was a director with ABO, where he was developing wind projects for over 10 years. I've worked with Paul over many years as part of IWEA, and he was instrumental really in leading a piece of work that was done there for underpinning the 70% target with a study with Baringa called 70 by 30, which showed that the 70% target was not just technically feasible, but also economically feasible for Ireland. And he's a chartered engineer, and it's great to have engineers of this calibre working on this problem in Ireland. So with that, I would like to welcome Paul to talk to us about managing curtailment in 2030.
Thanks very much, Bernice, for the introduction. As Bernice says, I'm Portfolio Director with Quilcha, and I've been chairing that 70 by 30 committee in IWEA that was given the responsibility of kind of generating the evidence basis for a 70% target, and I've been a member of the DS3 Advisory Council for the last little while as well, so I've kind of been quite active in this space over the last number of years. I suppose maybe the first question somebody might ask when you think of Quilcha, it's a semi-state forestry company. Why is a semi-state forestry company interested in curtailment? And I guess the clue is in the picture on the introduction slide there. So Quilcha, I didn't really appreciate it myself until I joined the company. It's the largest landowner in Ireland. It has an estate of about 440,000 hectares, which is about 7% of the land bank in Ireland. And there's a lot of that land is in kind of good, suitable locations for the development of renewable projects. Very much keen, or has a keen interest, I suppose, in this subject. I would say as well, like today is very much the focus is on the electricity sector. We're talking a lot about how do you kind of get to very, very deep penetration of renewables in that sector. And, it's a sector of growing importance. So as you look at kind of demand forecasts out to 2030, with data center demand growth and electrification of heat and transport, in terms of its scale, it is growing in scale. But it is also important to remember, if you look at today, in terms of emissions, it's about 2/3 of the emissions of the economy actually comes from energy, and as of today, only about 1/3 of that is electricity. So, we're doing some really important work, I think, in this sector. But I do think it's important that we don't forget the other sectors too. I suppose with that in mind, Quilcha very much sees itself as a kind of a sustainable business that can contribute in a number of different areas. So that they work on kind of innovative wood panel products as kind of alternatives to more fossil fuel intensive building materials, so kind of sustainable building materials. They are looking at kind of increasing the size of the estate, and they're working on other initiatives. So while it has a commercial focus, it's a company that very much would see it has a responsibility, I suppose, to support national policy objectives and kind of meet broader societal needs as well. But that's shameless plug for the people who pay my wages out of the way. So I'll maybe just get into things. So I just first introduce the project team. So obviously myself, I would have been involved in kind of the model development and the analysis. Rory Mullen, I think anyone who's worked in the renewable sector would know Rory very well. He's I suppose he's been kind of one of the leaders in the sector. Really puts a huge amount of time, I'd say, outside of his day-to-day consultancy work for greater good initiatives within the industry. So kind of very well-known figure in the industry, and he has his own kind of grid consultancy company. And Peter Lynn, who works for Rory, would do a lot of kind of banking grade curtailment analysis for for renewable projects, and he would have done a lot of the kind of QA on this project. James Carton is an assistant professor at DCU, and his kind of main research area would be in the area of hydrogen electrolysis and fuel cells. And we're not presenting on it today, but in the final report for this, looking out to 2040, we do a little piece of work on a potential role for hydrogen over that kind of a time frame. And then Connor was a recent graduate engineer, kind of bright young engineer, and he's done a good bit of work in terms of some of the animations and visualizations of the results. So just to kind of quickly introduce the project team. I think the key takeaway on this that Rory picked up on was never ever let engineers be responsible for their own photographs. I think Rory was taken by surprise on a night out in Tyrone on that one, but less said about that the better. So in terms of project, the project objectives, and maybe just to take a small step back, this is a project that would have started maybe 2.5 years ago as a hobby project for me. So I was working on a hydrogen research project, and I started to learn that it is a technology that might have the potential to do seasonal storage. And it just made me ask the question, how much storage would you need if you were trying to get to a 100% RESI system? So I kind of nights and weekends built a little model, started generating some results, and kind of reasonably interesting results pretty quickly. And then I started kind of engaging with Rory on it. And obviously being an engineer, you build a model. The next thing you want to kind of refine it, make it better. And so over a period of time, myself and Rory were kind of tic-tacking on it, and started to kind of build a bit of a picture as to what you need to do to get to these kind of very high penetration levels. And I suppose it was at that point that we were, obviously both of us are active in IWEA, and we would have taken some of this results and kind of shared it with some of the team in IWEA, and kind of built up a bit of a picture as to how a 70% target is actually something credible to aim for. And it was kind of on the back of that we kind of got into a more detailed costing exercise of the specific scenario that we identified by procuring that study that people may be familiar with. It's the Bring a 70/30 study. But the reason we kind of felt it was important to take that earlier work and actually write it up properly and disseminate it was the Bring a study, I suppose, looks at a particular scenario that was defined and did a very detailed costing exercise, but it doesn't necessarily explain the relative importance of some of the measures that are included within it. So we kind of felt it would be useful to write this body of work up properly and just kind of outline why some of the measures are very, very important and critical, and others are kind of, they help make the whole system more efficient, but they would be, I suppose, in terms of hitting 70% in the kind of nice to have category as opposed to essential. So for this, we made an application to SEAI for some funding. And they awarded the funding, and we kind of got on with this project that we're kind of presenting today. So we started with the model we had, and we made some further refinements to allow the model to do more on demand side management. And then we went through a kind of a calibration exercise to make sure it was generating sensible results comparable with what we were seeing in the real world on EirGrid's curtailment reports. And then I suppose we set about investigating the individual measures one at a time. And in order to do that, we had to kind of break the system by adding a silly amount of wind to it, trying to get to a very high renewable penetration level without doing anything else, just by adding more wind and seeing what happened. And that kind of defined the problem. And then from that problem, we started individually looking at different measures that would help kind of bring that down. And then obviously to disseminate it. The next thing we did, I suppose, was then to take those measures that were working best and start layering them on top of each other one at a time. To kind of see how high you could get to in terms of renewable penetration without curtailment getting to kind of silly levels and wasting lots of energy. And then I suppose we kind of animated the results to kind of help take this massive data and try and generate some kind of useful visualizations to kind of help explain the story. It is very important to note that we're not at all in this study considering limitations on the transmission system. So in terms of constraints, on the transmission network, we're not modeling that here, and that is a very, very important piece of the jigsaw puzzle to get to a high renewable penetration. But just to kind of call that out at the start, and I might circle back to that at the very end because it's an important point and a key point. And another point is that we are modeling curtailment here on a pro rata basis, which basically means that when there's a surplus of renewables on the system that the system can't take, we're allocating that burden equally among the generators. There is something in the clean energy package that needs to be looked at the moment around priority dispatch and the loss of priority dispatch for new generators. And with what I would say would be the wrong interpretation of that, or at least not a very helpful one, there would be a risk that the burden of curtailment could all be put on new generators, and that could have a material impact on what we're trying to do here. So just to maybe call out those two assumptions before we kind of get into it. So I don't know how, like, maybe I know some people in the room here are very familiar with this, and some of what I might be saying will be quite basic, but just to kind of cover the basics for people who aren't so familiar with it. What is curtailment? So just to kind of illustrate what we've done there is plotted a sample 24-hour period, and that's your kind of starting demand curve. We then layer on, so on this particular day, the conventional generators that we're running kind of each hour of the day. We then layer on the uncontrollable wind, so that's kind of small scale wind generation where EirGrid don't have the ability to send it a signal to tell it to turn down. So if that's there, it's there. You can't turn it off if you like. And then we layer on the available wind on this particular day. And you can see, obviously, as you stack that up, we now have a surplus. So, absent any kind of mitigation solution or strategy to kind of manage curtailment, all that energy above the line there is being wasted. So you're looking at kind of megawatts on the y-axis there, so you can very quickly get to quite a large number of megawatt hours of kind of clean renewable energy that's not getting used. We then look at, in Ireland at the moment, we have one pumped hydro project. So when you turn on Turlock Hill, the blue area there is effectively the space that Turlock Hill is able to create for renewable power in Ireland. But what you can see there is that storage technologies that are energy limited, they get full after a relatively short period of time, and then they can't do very much for you. So when you look at interconnectors, they're not limited in the same way. Interconnectors are kind of complex in terms of the direction of the power flow, and will it always export when you want it to export? And I'll maybe speak a little bit more to that later on. But in principle, provided you're connecting to a market that's able to absorb your power, it's not energy limited in the same way. It shouldn't really get full if the demand is there. If the conventional generation on the neighbouring jurisdiction that you're connected to isn't operating, at its absolute minimum level, then there should be capacity to kind of dispatch surplus renewable energy at times of high wind in Ireland to other jurisdictions. And you can see, like, that just even on this simple graph, you can see has a much more meaningful impact on the curtailment, and you waste an awful lot less energy when you have the ability to do that. For people who don't know anything at all about power systems, the first question you might ask is, why is there that big brown blob of conventional generation at the bottom? And the reason is, today you can't, the system would become unstable if you allow the conventional generation to get too low. There's a variety of different system stability services that are kind of inherent with conventional generation, and without doing something about that, you need to keep that minimum level there. So what we've done for this study is we're kind of taking what's actually a very complex series of operational constraints that EirGrid have to employ when they're dispatching the power system, and we simplify it down to a parameter called minimum generation. And so if you look at that graph, what you're seeing there is kind of the minimum generation level there is that figure there is roughly where it's at today. Now there's another parameter that I'm just going to come on to. So that's kind of an aggregate of all the different operational constraints. When we talk about this issue, a parameter that comes up a lot that people may have heard of is the system non-synchronous penetration limit. So that's effectively, it's non-synchronous generation plus interconnector imports divided by demand plus exports. And in kind of real layman's terms, for our purposes in the Irish market, you can almost read that to be wind generation divided by demand and interconnector exports, because you tend not to be importing, or at least you shouldn't be importing at times when you have a lot of wind on the system. So that's a kind of a parameter that EirGrid has a constraint on. So in the original facilitation of renewable studies that were done in advance of kind of putting the DS3 program together, again, that people may be familiar with, they would have identified in that study that the system could operate relatively safely at a 50% penetration level, but to go to 75%, they needed to do quite a bit of work to facilitate that level of penetration. And that is kind of, for a grid of our size and our reliability, that is, world leading stuff. It's really cutting edge work that EirGrid have been doing on that. And the DS3 program was effectively the program they put in place to allow the system to go from 50% penetration to 75% penetration by 2030. I think today we're at 65. I believe we might be trialing 70 by the end of the year. And as I say, even at that, that's already world leading stuff. And there's many countries around the world looking to the work EirGrid are doing to kind of understand what's possible in this space. But what I would say is that is one operational constraint. There's a whole bunch of other ones. And when you aggregate them together, the end result is there's a big stack of conventional generation that's kind of almost in the way of renewables, that you can't fit more renewables on a system. Just maybe to show that curtailment is real. So this is kind of a graph of historic curtailment, and you'll see there's a general trend that curtailment has been rising, and that's obviously as we've been adding more and more wind generation to the system. You do see a dip there in 2016, which is kind of related to, I think it was a relatively low wind year, so just the wind speeds in that year were not as high as kind of you typically would get, and demand was also kind of growing in that year, so that was what caused that dip in 2016. But it's trending up towards kind of 4.5–5%. But I would say again, if it wasn't for some of the really unbelievable work EirGrid have been doing in this space, if we were still at a 50% SNSP level and at the minimum generation levels that we would have had a number of years ago, that would be a lot higher. You could be looking at 10–15% of the power being wasted. So there's a lot of good stuff has been happening in that space. Industry will always want more, kind of in our nature. But every now and again, you have to just acknowledge and take a step back and just look at what they've been doing, and it's impressive stuff. I'll just briefly cover the policy context because it is important. So if you think to how did we get to where we are today, and kind of looking towards 2020, and I suppose the Renewable Energy Directive in 2009 would have put a binding target on Ireland for renewable energy in total, and Ireland's response to that was to come up with this National Renewable Energy Action Plan. Within that overall plan, it set individual targets for heat, transport, and electricity. But it was in that plan that the 40% target for renewable electricity emerged, and I think that was what gave the mandate to EirGrid, to ESB, to the regulators, to kind of it's that kind of policy target that gives everyone, all the other key stakeholders, the mandate to kind of do the work they need to do to kind of get to these very, very high penetration levels. The next generation, if you like, of that is the Clean Energy Package for all Europeans. So that's looking at an EU-wide target for renewable energy of 32%. And it's being worked a little differently in that the individual countries are being asked to come forward with how they can contribute to that target. So it's not a kind of a binding target on individual countries. And Ireland would have submitted its first draft of its NECP back in December 2018. And I think in June this year, the European Union would come back, kind of indicating that it wasn't ambitious enough. And I suppose since Minister Blount has kind of gotten into office, we've really seen a sea change, and the energy and ambition that he's after bringing to this issue has been fantastic for the industry, and what we're now seeing in the Climate Action Plan, and actually just with everything that's kind of going on maybe in the UK, I think everyone loves criticising politicians. This actually was supported, I would say, cross-party. So there was a joint Oireachtas committee with all parties cooperating, working together to help kind of come up with this. But I think Minister Blount has definitely shown real leadership on this point, and it's great to see. And it's now I think that's laid down the marker really for the entire sector. EirGrid, ESB, the regulator, and industry to try and step up now and deliver. And so that's maybe kind of the policy piece. And I would say on the technical side, DS3 was kind of the response to the policy mandate for 2020. I suppose the first version of what that might be for 2030 is this EU Sysflex project that EirGrid have been leading. It's a kind of a European-wide project. Again, lots of fantastic stuff happening in that space. And that seems to be laying the groundwork for, let's call it, the next generation of DS3. Which I think is going to be we'll come on to it, but I think it'll be one of the key enablers for that 70% target. Speak just briefly to demand growth. So this is the point I was making at the beginning, that the electricity sector is kind of growing relatively rapidly, and it's primarily been driven by a huge growth in demand for data, particularly around Dublin. And so this graph here is kind of looking from 2009, where demand has been, and looking at the EirGrid generation capacity statements and their demand forecasts out to 2030. And you are seeing this steep rise in demand up to 2025. There's certainly a question mark as to what happens after 2025. I certainly don't think there's going to be less data. So the question maybe there is, I think EirGrid are kind of saying they can only forecast on what they can see. I think it's an open question. You do hear of technological developments in the data center sector in terms of the efficiency of the data centers, but there's certainly a question there as to will that growth actually really taper off at that level. I just leave that maybe hang as an open question. And then obviously, we're seeing as part of the Climate Action Plan, significant plans to kind of increase electrification in the heat and transport sectors. But again, just to make the point, if you look at the actual numbers and look at where the growth is, I should say the figures we're using here for EVs and heat pumps, this study would have been carried out in advance of the climate action plan, so that they have grown a bit since this study was done. But even so, when you put them beside the data center demand, it's relatively modest in terms of its contribution. Okay, so after the long introduction, this is kind of getting into now the study itself. So what you're looking at there is, before I kind of start running animations, so what you're looking at there is kind of hours in the day along the x-axis, and up the y-axis we have the 365 days in the year. And so this is kind of effectively pretty much the 2020 system in terms of what we expect to be built in 2020 and what we expect in terms of the SNSP limits, all the different system constraints. And what you see is because we're looking at 2030 demand, so with that higher demand figure, this is the all-island wind capacity that we expect to have installed. This is where RESI would be with that higher demand. So we're taking 2030 demand, the 2020 system as a starting point. And when I run this animation in a second, you'll see the wind capacity. We're just going to keep adding wind. You'll see RESI will keep going up, but you'll see this dial, which is effectively the percentage of all the available energy that gets wasted, rising as you just keep adding wind, and we're not doing anything else to kind of mitigate the curtailment. So I'll just run that. And sorry, on the heat map as well, you'll see obviously the different colors come up. It's just in each individual hour, obviously the darker the color, the more intense the curtailment is in that hour. Is this working? We are working. So what you see there is in the beginning, curtailment is much more of a nighttime problem. So you're seeing a lot of curtailment happening between kind of midnight and 8 in the morning, and you can actually almost see a line there as everyone's getting up to turn on their kettles, and demand is starting to ramp up. So you can imagine where you're seeing this is effectively all the periods of high wind, and as demand peaks up, you're seeing almost a line where, like, if you can imagine the wind blowing, the wind comes, weather systems come in for a day or two at a time. So when it's running and demand is low at night, you're wasting more energy. But as demand starts to pick up, you see this kind of line here as the curtailment kind of starts to reduce. But you're seeing, like at this level here, we're only getting to 54% RESI. That's getting close to enough wind to get us to a 70% target. But because we're wasting about 13 or 14% of that energy, we're a long way short in terms of the RESI level. And as you run it on, it is actually theoretically possible to get to, sorry, I hope this will work. Yeah, so as you run it on, you'll see that, we can actually get to 70% RESI just by adding wind, but, it doesn't need too much explaining. Curtailment is kind of getting to close to 45%, and, you can see that it's about 70-80% of the year, there's some sort of curtailment happening. The events are very, very long duration. And that's a very important graph. So what I would call it, from an engineering perspective, I would call this defining the problem. So the problem, there's huge amounts of energy there that you have to try and somehow manage. And when you think about the solutions that might actually help with that, just think about that. It's massive, massive amounts of energy that somehow need to be managed. So we did the same exercise with solar, just kind of as a curiosity. So we're kind of starting here. I think there's about 300 megawatts of solar in Northern Ireland. There's almost nothing in Ireland, in the Republic. And sorry, this animation is a little bit slow. You'll have to bear with me. So we kind of start adding solar, and you see we started from 35% RESI, which was the 2020 wind. And as we keep adding solar capacity, the RESI starts going up. But it's going up more slowly because solar in Ireland has a much lower capacity factor. So, you're adding an awful lot of solar to make a more modest contribution to the RESI target, and that's purely capacity factor. And as you keep going, the nature of the solar curtailment problem is quite different. So it's not a long duration problem. It's an intensity problem. So because you're having to add so much capacity to knock a dent in the RESI target, that you end up with these very, very tall spikes of energy, and you still have these massive quantities of energy to try and move around or manage. Now, we kind of just to test, is it even theoretically possible to get to 70%? And it's kind of obvious when you think about it that it isn't with solar, because you're only generating through a very limited number of hours in the day. So we kind of went to silly figures with 50 gigawatts and you get to 56% RESE. But I think curtailment, it kind of goes off the chart there. It's above 70%. Now, if there's any solar developers in the room, I do have some good stuff to say about solar later. So if the sniper rifles are out, you can put them back in the holster for a few minutes. I am going to say some good stuff later. Very good. Okay, so that's kind of defining the problem in terms of the curtailment challenge. So what we now look at is what are the different strategies that you can try and deploy to manage that curtailment and create space on the system for renewables. So we look at relieving these operational constraints. So if you can find the technical solutions to these operational constraints to allow the system to run with much, much less conventional generation on it, how much space can you create? And then we look at interconnector capacity, storage technologies of different energy durations. A surprising one when we get to it was the wind capacity factor. So we looked at what's the impact of actually increasing the wind capacity factor, and that's effectively larger rotors without increasing the generators too much. I'll explain that in more detail in a minute, but it was quite a positive and surprising result we got on that. We then look at kind of the diversification value of actually integrating a bit of solar into the mix, and we look at kind of demand side management and what that can do. So this is, if John O'Sullivan can see this, he'll probably shoot me, but this is the most unbelievably simplified version of the interactions between all the operational constraints and curtailment. So, and it's I suppose the point we're trying to make here is there's a lot of focus on the SNSP, and this is something Eir would understand very, very well, but there's a lot of focus on the instantaneous penetration of renewables on the system, but you hear less about the other operational constraints that cause conventional generation to run, or to make it essential that that conventional generation runs. So we first look at kind of, and this is somewhat at kind of a hypothetical exercise, because a lot of the things that you might do to facilitate a high SNSP limit by their nature would have the effect of reducing min-gen. So there is a kind of a complex engineering relationship between the solutions for SNSP and min-gen, but they're not directly linked. So it's not necessarily like some of the things that you would do to increase SNSP wouldn't necessarily get rid of the min-gen problem. But you can see there, if you go to 100% SNSP as an individual constraint, there's a tiny improvement in curtailment. So we're starting here from this broken system with 45% of the energy being wasted, and we increase the SNSP limit to the point where that individual constraint is kind of gone, but it doesn't do much while all the other constraints remain. And then likewise, if you take all the other constraints away, all these other things that are causing you to have to run conventional generation, but you leave the instantaneous limit at 75%, again, you'll see an initial small improvement, but very quickly the SNSP is now the binding problem and nothing much happens. Now we kind of look at, let's do the two together. So let's kind of increase the SNSP limit and solve all these other operational constraint issues. And here we do it to the point where we completely remove the constraints. And what you see is very quickly there's a huge, huge impact. And so it effectively, if you could do it, and the engineering challenges in this are immense, but if you could do this, you solve 3/4 of the problem just with that measure. And I was at Airgrid's strategy launch there in the last few days, and Mark Foley has come out, and I hope he's not writing checks that John O'Sullivan's body can't cash, but he has come out saying, Airgrid are working towards a 95% SNSP limit. And I think if you're at 95% SNSP, that's pointless if you're not fixing the other operational constraints and reducing the min-gen. So the Airgrid are certainly thinking about getting somewhere, maybe not quite to here, but not very far away, and probably for 2040. This could be what you're looking at, is a completely non-synchronous system. Okay, so then I suppose the next thing we looked at, so again, we're kind of starting from the left-hand side of the graph, we're kind of starting with curtailment at 45%, and the first technology we looked at was kind of battery storage. And here we're looking at 3-hour batteries, so effectively they get full after 3 hours. And what you're finding is, because of that limited energy duration, when you have a curtailment event, the battery gets full very quickly, and once it's full, it sits there full for a very long time, waiting to find space to kind of discharge before it can kind of empty itself and then be available to charge again. So because of that energy limitation, what batteries can do for you on this kind of a system is not very much. And a bit like the solar, I have good stuff to say about batteries as well in a minute. So again, anyone who's developing batteries, please don't shoot me. And then obviously when you look to energy or storage technologies that have kind of greater energy capacity, so they don't get full as quick. So if you take Turlock Hill, has 6 hours of capacity, it's about 290 megawatts, I think. So with 6 hours of energy, obviously, you see more of an improvement. But to put that into context, like I say, Turlock Hill is say 290 megawatts, so round numbers 300. The right-hand side of that graph will be the equivalent of 10 Turlock Hills. So again, it's the energy limitation is kind of not allowing you to create the space you need. And it's the same story as you carry on. So you can go to 15 hours, you can go to 30 hours. Like obviously at 30 hours, you are seeing much more of an impact. But that's, that's 10 Turlock Hills, but with 5 times, the reservoirs have to be 5 times bigger on 10 of them to have that kind of an impact. So when you put that beside some of the alternative solutions to get you from the 43, 44% to 20-ish, that's a pretty expensive solution if that's what you're using it for. And sorry, the next thing we looked at then was kind of interconnectors. And I should have mentioned earlier actually as well, with all these storage technologies and with the interconnectors, we're modeling them in an idealized way. So we're dispatching them in the model in a way that has the absolute maximum impact on curtailment. So we're not doing full kind of Plexus price modeling. We're just, whatever it can do to help curtailment in the model, we're maximizing all the technologies to do that. So in the case of the interconnectors here, like this graph would represent a situation where 100% of the capacity of the interconnector exports the power when you want it to mitigate curtailment. So it's very much idealized. Like in the real world, I think today what you're seeing in the day ahead markets, they're about 90% effective in terms of how they're scheduled. But by the time they get to real time, that's about more like 50%. So there's a body of work there. I'll maybe touch back on it later on. But there's a body of work there to investigate kind of what's causing that kind of, from a curtailment perspective, I would call it loss of performance. I'm sure the market economists would have a very different view of it, but it'd be good to understand why real-time dispatch is kind of not exporting the power as much as you would like it to for curtailment. But certainly, even in a pretty positive case, that graph might look something like that. To be coming, down there somewhere if it was that kind of 90% effectiveness. But certainly what you are seeing is like what we're trying to see here is what are the solutions that have the highest potential to solve curtailment, and interconnectors are certainly up there alongside the relieving operational constraints. And I would say again though, the operational constraints is safe. If you create that space on the system, you won't have that's safe space. Because of the interconnectors and how they work and how they respond to kind of pricing in different jurisdictions, there's a little bit more of a risk to how they actually perform, and it depends on renewable development in neighbouring jurisdictions. So yeah, just maybe to again because we've kind of said what batteries don't do very well, it's important to kind of call out what they do quite well. So in terms of system services, so some of the things that some of the solutions to the operational constraint problems, batteries can do some of that. They can do fast frequency response, they can do reserves. So there's a bunch of kind of system stability services that batteries can provide. They can do ramping quite well, and something we haven't noted it in this presentation, but something you do see as you increase the renewable penetration, you can get times when a weather system is kind of passing over around 7 in the morning. So you've the generation from renewables starting to drop off just as demand is starting to ramp up. And that's effectively increasing the burden on the rest of the fleet to kind of ramp up quickly and kind of meet that short-term need. And that's something that batteries can do very, very well. They are, so in terms of security supply, you could certainly look at batteries as an alternative to fossil fuel peaking plants. In the case of network investment, where there is a demand constraint, so it doesn't work particularly well if you have a constraint on the generation side. So let's say you have a wire that's full of wind energy, batteries isn't necessarily something that will create a lot of space on that wire. But in a situation where you're struggling to meet demand, batteries can be an alternative solution to building new wires, because that demand peak tends to be over a relatively short duration. So when the need is kind of short, you're talking a short number of hours, batteries can play an important role there. We mentioned kind of maximizing auto production and energy arbitrage. Energy arbitrage, there's a kind of a commercial aspect to that, which is making use of high pricing and low pricing in the market, and a commercial case. From a technical perspective, I would think of arbitrage as allowing the remaining conventional fleet to operate closer to its optimal efficiency levels. So you can imagine on these renewable systems, when as you've lots and lots of wind on the system and it's ramping up and down, there's lots of balancing required, and that's causing conventional plants to kind of have to move up and down a lot of way. And if you can kind of, I suppose, smooth that burden on the conventionals to have to ramp up and down quickly, that improves the efficiency of the remaining conventional fleet as well, because we certainly do need conventional plant as well. So that's just maybe a few words to kind of what batteries can do. This is kind of, again, because when we started this work, there would have been an awful lot of talk about what demand side management can do to integrate renewables. And I think if you look at the system today, where curtailment is primarily a nighttime problem, on today's system where you've got about 5% curtailment, demand side management would allow you to shift demand from day to night and help alleviate that. But with the kind of problem, if you think back to that heat map with curtailment happening absolutely everywhere, unless you can shift demand from, from the summertime to the wintertime, it's pretty hard to have a huge impact with it. And that was kind of confirmed. So again, we model this in an idealized way. The x-axis there at the bottom is kind of a percentage of the electrical vehicle demand that we allow to just move wherever the model needs it to mitigate curtailment. So we start off with kind of on the left-hand side, none of it is flexible. And over to the right-hand side, all of the electric vehicle demand is allowed to go anywhere at all that it needs to reduce curtailment. And that's what we got. So it's not, but the problem is, it's the nature of the problem is on a moderate renewable system, it's a completely different problem. On a very, very high resi system, it just doesn't do what you might think it would. Now, the other point there, of course, is we are talking about a relatively small percentage of the total demand. So the two problems are, there's hardly anywhere to put it, and there's not very much of it if you're only looking at EVs. So on the later slides, we do look at kind of flexibility coming from just the broader demand base, if you like. And then the second thing we did was we took the heat pumps that are on the system. I think it was about 500,000 heat pumps. We allowed that there was 500 litre cylinders behind all those. We let the temperature in those cylinders vary between 25 and 30 and 55 degrees, so a kind of a 30-degree temperature differential in the cylinders. And so there was obviously a demand from the cylinders taking energy from them, and the model insisted that demand be met. So that was a kind of a constraint. But subject to that constraint, whenever there was a surplus of wind, we let those cylinders get charged up, and so it was kind of really maximizing that 30-degree temperature differential to see what it could do to help us with curtailment. And again, that was the change. So when you added that to the EVs, you can hardly see the gap. And it's the same problem. It's just not, the amount of energy you're trying to manage is massive, and there's not very much energy capacity in that. Now, I would say, I know there's people have done studies on integrating heat, and I think the story might potentially be quite different if you're looking at something like district heating, where you have a much, much larger energy reservoir. But and it's all about the energy. It's all about having a large enough energy reservoir. Okay, this was kind of quite an interesting one. So I'll let this come up, and I'll have to explain it because it kind of catches a lot of people. So it seems counterintuitive. What we're seeing here is the higher the capacity factor of the wind, which means the more production you get from the wind, the lower the curtailment. And the reason that seems counterintuitive is it kind of is. So what we've done here is every single point on that line represents a 70% resi system. So as we put better producing turbines on the system, we're actually reducing the amount of installed capacity that you need. So the energy is going up, but the megawatts are coming down. Like the energy per turbine is going up, but the total installed capacity is coming down. And that kind of has the effect of flattening the generation profile from the wind. And when you do that, it's kind of taking energy from off the peaks, putting more of it out on the shoulders. And we did expect this to have a benefit, but we didn't expect it to be quite as strong as it was. So that's certainly telling a story that with modern turbine technologies going to kind of larger rotors, higher tip heights, and certainly with offshore as well in the mix, if we can push the total capacity or the average capacity factor of the entire fleet up, you will see a very substantial system benefit. And the analogy I've been kind of using on this, like in a former life, I would have been involved in construction, and in the housing boom, we kind of built houses, right up to 2007. I think it was around 2007, 2008, they brought in the insulation regulations and we stopped building houses. There's possibly a moment like this here where we're just about to start building a hell of a lot of wind, and if we can make sure that that is kind of high capacity factor wind, and it's going to be on the system for 25, 30 years, you're kind of you're making the challenge from 2030 to 2040 easier, because the nature of the fleet is just better. It naturally integrates better to the system. Okay, so what we did, I suppose that was kind of assessing the various different measures, and I will come back. I didn't specifically show the work package there on integrating solar, but it comes up in this next piece. So what we're doing in the next piece is we're kind of implementing these measures one at a time, layering them one on top of the other, and kind of seeing how high can we go. So what you're looking at here is we're now kind of starting again from the bottom up, and we're saying to the model, don't let curtailment get higher than 5%. So as we implement a mitigation solution, it creates space on the system for more wind. We add that wind in the model up until curtailment hits 5, and then we stop. So each time we implement a mitigation solution, it creates space. RESI goes up, but we limit it at that 5%. And sorry, now I've been playing with this model, and the animations have been kind of playing up with me, so I might have to implement a backup plan here in a minute, but the first few I think work okay. So we're kind of starting here at 75% RESI or SNSP, about 1400 megawatts of minimum conventional generation. And because we've started, curtailment would have dropped off to 0 because we started with high demand on the 2020 system. So the first thing we did was we kind of added wind until we got to 5% curtailment again. So that took us up to that level. Hopefully this works. There we go. Yeah. So now we're kind of moving up to this. This would have been the figures that we would have shared with or worked with Bring on, and so that's allowing the SNSP level can get to 90%, and the minimum operating level of conventional generation can drop to 700. And as I say, EirGrid are now coming out saying that they're targeting here. So they're hoping to do more than what we have on this slide. And that one measure gets you to 55% RESI, which would have been the government's original ambition, just with that one measure. Now I say just with that one measure, there's a lot of complex stuff has to happen to deliver that, but we do. Like in Ireland, we have some of the best power systems engineers anywhere in the world. They have a track record of delivering on this in the past, and I certainly have faith that they will do it again in the future. So the next thing we looked at was interconnector capacity, but to address the problem of modelling it in an idealised fashion, when we're adding capacity here, we're actually modelling 90% of that. So we're allowing that if you build 1,000 megawatts of interconnectors, on average 900 megawatts of that is exporting when you wanted to reduce curtailment. And again, hopefully this works. I'll give it a second. There we go. Okay. That's not working very well. I might have to implement the backup plan here, but so what you find in this result is when you add the Greenlink interconnector, the Celtic interconnector, and relieve some of the existing constraints on the Moyle interconnector, that measure gets you up to 70%. And I'm just going to step out of this presentation for a minute because I have a feeling these animations are going to play up, and I'll just kind of skip straight to the numbers. If you're all engineers in the room, I hope you don't mind numbers. So what's happening here is this is kind of adding. We're starting here with EWIC and Moyle is currently, I think, restricted to 80 megawatts, and this is kind of what we're modelling, the 522 megawatts of export capacity. And you can see that as you add the interconnectors, you can add more wind, and you're keeping the wind curtailment and the total renewable curtailment below the 5% level, and that gets you to this 68.5% RESI again with just that measure. And then the next measure we implemented then was to kind of start increasing the wind capacity factors. And again, we started on an assumption of 35% in 2030 because there will be natural, just by normal development, moving to new technologies, there will be an improvement in capacity factors. But we're saying, maybe with some policy incentives, you can push that up a little bit further. And so we're saying, if you could achieve across the fleet a 38% capacity factor, you'll see here actually that the installed capacity of wind is reducing. So we only need, instead of 12.2 gigawatts at 35%, you can actually drop that to 11.8 at 38%. and the resi is taking a jump up there. It's going from close to 70 up to the 73.5. Now, for the solar developers in the room, this is kind of the good news story for solar. So what we did here is we added solar to the mix, and because solar has a negative correlation with wind, it's not generating so often at the same time as wind. You can fit more power on the system in very, very simple terms. But obviously in the model, if we only add solar, so if we're already at 5% curtailment, if we just add solar to that, anything at all is going to push us up over our 5% limit. So in this work stream, we started adding solar, but we removed wind to keep the curtailment level at 5%. And what we found is that you kind of you max out in this particular set of assumptions. You max out at about 77% resi, and after that, if you add more solar, resi starts going down and curtailment starts going up, basically. So that effectively 7 gigawatts in this one scenario would have been the curtailment sweet spot in terms of the mix. Now, it's not the commercial sweet spot. That's a different question. So this is very much a technical curtailment minimization, res maximization exercise. So, and I wouldn't speak to the commercials on it. You'd have to look at the kind of price difference between solar and wind to figure out what's the commercial sweet spot. But I would suspect that this might not be something that would have been evaluated when the solar ambitions were being set out in the climate action plan. So it is a benefit of having a bit more solar in the mix. Exactly what the right answer is between 1 gigawatt and 7 gigawatts, you'd have to wait and see what the auctions turn up to determine that. What we then did is we started looking at the demand side flexibility. So, but here, because there wasn't very much energy just coming from the electric vehicles, we started making some of the background demand flexible as well. So we took starting at 5, 10, then 15, and with EVs we went from 20 to 40 to 60. So it's pretty aggressive assumptions, I would say, on demand flexibility. But we are seeing, because you've implemented all the other more major solutions first, and you're taking curtailment back to being a bit more of a daytime nighttime problem. This is now having a little bit more of a benefit, but it's also the fact that we're taking in a bit of background demand, and that's kind of getting up to 82% resi at this stage. And then the final step was to kind of make those heat cylinders flexible again, and that takes you up to 83. So that was kind of where we got to, I suppose. Now, obviously, that's a scenario where pretty much everything is going your way. It's everything going exactly as you would like it to go. I'll just go back to the slide deck here now. Sorry, try again. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on there. Yeah, so I suppose, that kind of wraps up where we got to with that piece of the work. There is a follow-on section where we're looking at 2040. We're looking at kind of 100% resi scenarios in 2040, exploring hydrogen, and that'll be in the kind of final report on the project. But in terms of the dissemination piece for the 2030, that's kind of where we got to. And to kind of wrap up, I suppose, on recommendations, I mean, what's clearly coming through the results for us is it's very much highlighting the importance of the work that EirGrid are doing on the DS30 to relieve the operational constraints for them to achieve the ambition they've now set out on 95% resi. And it's like, that is a massive technical challenge. I mean, that is kind of a moonshot project for Ireland, but we do have the right people to be able to take that on. And as I said, I certainly have faith that they will achieve it. There's the clean energy package rules. I think this priority dispatch question, that's an important issue. It's something that needs an appropriate interpretation if it's not going to cause us a lot of trouble. New interconnectors are definitely needed, and I think just today there was an announcement that the Celtic interconnector has been awarded funding, the 500 million funding from the European Union. I think market design is an important point. So this is not something that we've studied, but we're highlighting in our study that the interconnector flows and how they behave is important, and there's certainly potential for market design to either make those perform better for renewables or worse. There's a few other things, and this is maybe under the heading of a pet theory I would have at the moment, that I think the operational constraints on the system might be causing. So when we're seeing this kind of 90% effectiveness of interconnectors in the day-ahead market, so they're being scheduled, if you like, correctly in the day-ahead market, where there's not so much consideration of the operational constraints on the system. I would kind of wonder, as those operational constraints are imposed, could that be causing the interconnectors to not perform as you might like them to from a curtailment perspective? So there's market design questions there, and I think more work needed on interconnector behaviours, just to kind of understand better what drives the flows and try to make sure that they work to help the integration of renewables rather than hinder them. I would try out there that the result on the high capacity factors of wind was so strong that I think it does warrant exploring to see, is there merit in trying to incentivize developers to select turbines that will give you higher capacity factors. People think that you would do that anyway, but it's not necessarily the case. When you're selecting a turbine, you're generally trying to minimize cost of energy, and that isn't always the highest capacity factor turbine. In fact, it's very often not. And we would say, look, incorporate solar if you want to optimize high res E, but I think there's a body of work to be done there to figure out what's the commercial sweet spot. So we would say the curtailment sweet spot is probably quite a lot, but I think there's a separate exercise there to kind of figure out the commercial sweet spot. And I think that review the benefit of storage and demand side management for the capacity and system services. So like these things, demand side management does have value, storage does have value, but they need the market designs around them need to incentivize them to do the things that they do well. I mean, I suppose that really to sum up, and maybe to echo what Bernice said, I mean, I think we are in very, very interesting times in the sector. The ambition has been laid out by government. It's been there's been a lot of the ambition. EirGrid are now showing ambition, leadership, vision. A lot of that's in place now, and I think we're now at the point where it's time to kind of roll up the sleeves and do the work and actually make it happen, actually deliver it. Like it's a big challenge, but it's one I think as a country we're in a good place to take it on with the right people. There's a lot of expertise have been built up over the last few years, and we're seeing across all the key stakeholders, since that target has been set down across ESB, EirGrid, the regulators, there's a change in the mood, and it's exciting times for the industry. And with that, I'd kind of conclude and throw it out to the floor for questions.
We have a mic. Thanks very much for that, Paul. Maybe just while people are thinking of questions, we do have one in from the web stream from Garrod Fitzgerald, who says, "Great presentation. 2 questions. If we were to dispatch surplus renewable energy when Irish supply outstrips demand to export, would the power prices need to drop to very low prices, potentially negative pricing, as CHP plants will want to keep running? And would we be paying consumers in other markets to consume power generated in Ireland?"
I mean, certainly that was the point on the power flows on the interconnector. So they flow from the cheaper jurisdiction to the higher jurisdiction. Wind would bid in to the market at zero. It's a zero marginal cost plant. I mean, I think you will see quite low market pricing. You will see low market pricing at times of high wind. You're seeing that in Germany already, and it's maybe, again, I would put it back to the question of, on a very, very high resi system, is the market design we have today actually suitable for a very high resi system? And I would seriously question that. And I think in Ireland we're seeing it, maybe more than some other jurisdictions, like Germany would see it as well. And I think there's certainly a realization in Europe that the market was designed, when there was a lot of plant that had a marginal cost of operation. When you move to a system that's very, like 70% of it, of the power being provided is coming from generation that's got a zero marginal cost of operation, but has a higher capital cost. It's a fundamentally different technology that you're trying to develop on the network. And so, I think there's a question there to make sure that the market design is appropriate so that you get the right mix of plant, and that everyone, all of the plant that you need on the system has can be commercially viable, because without that, nothing works. So I take the point, and I think, but I would point to one of the takeaways that we would have on this is, we need to look at the market design and make sure it's fit for purpose.
Yeah. And just one more from Garrod before we go to the room here. Is the 70% renewable target creating problems which we don't need to solve? Should we instead be focusing on the decarbonisation target, integrating an optimal level of renewables and utilising zero carbon firm power with hydrogen produced in SMR or by CCS to deliver the least cost solution to decarbonisation? Broader question.
I might have to read that again. Sorry, apologies. Well, to address the first point first, I mean, I think the value of the Bringa study that IWEA commissioned is, we kind of show that 70% can be no regrets if it's done right. So if you take it the direction of travel on the cost of renewables, if you look at the recent offshore auctions in the UK, there's certainly an expectation as you deploy new technology onshore in Ireland as well. The cost of production of renewables is really going through the floor. And so even when you build in the additional costs of providing the additional system services, upgrading the network, it's when you add it all together, and the Bringa study did it quite well. And actually, the way the Bringa study did it is that they figured out what price does the wind energy technology need to get to make this kind of a no regrets option for the consumers. And that price is already being beaten in most markets today. It was, I think, €60 a megawatt hour for onshore wind, 70 for offshore. You're seeing prices well below that in the market already. So to the first point, are we solving a problem we don't need to solve? I don't think so. I think we need to decarbonize everything. I made the point at the start, like it's the electricity sector, heat, transport, and the rest of the wider economy. I mean, agriculture is a very challenging one to tackle. So we need to do everything. This is one piece of the jigsaw, but there's lots of other pieces. If I'll just come back to the rest of the question here, so focus on decarbonization. Yeah. Okay, so I think the point he's making is, can you strip the CO2 from methane, go to hydrogen and carbon capture and storage? I know a little bit about that area. I'm certainly not an expert in it. The little bit I've seen is that I believe that would be an extremely expensive solution. But I'm not expert in that area. I've read a few articles on it. I do think in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe there could be a role for hydrogen through electrolysis as well. But I think that's for a little bit down the road. Yeah. I hope that answers. It's the one disadvantage on these questions. Yeah, you can't debate the point.
Thanks, Gerald. I think we've a question in Barry.
Hi, Paul. Barry McMullen here from DCU. Thanks a million for the presentation. I'm going to say it was wonderful because of my colleague James Garton being involved with it. I think it's a really nice project, and the kind of interactions you've highlighted are very interesting and very provocative. But kind of continuing from the previous question, I'm personally not a fan of percentage penetration as a target at all. And I think decarbonisation is actually what we care about, even above curtailment. And I go back to the late, great David Mackay, used to say, don't be an efficiency snob. Because really, when you're talking about curtailment as a bad thing, you're saying, well, we're losing. We had this energy at the primary stage. It's not showing up in final consumption, so that is effectively a conversion loss somewhere in the system. But don't be an efficiency snob. So the question we're really ultimately interested in is getting the carbon dioxide out of the system at the least cost. Okay, if it turned out that involved curtailment of 45 or 50% was the cheapest way, because the sort of scale of storage you're talking about to move that 45% somewhere else in time was more expensive than just throwing it away when you don't use it, well, then so be it. So that's really, I wouldn't get fixated necessarily on curtailment as the criterion. And the last thing I want to say just about it is, and I don't know if you've even thought about this or looked at this, but my strong suspicion, no more than that, is that if we were looking at the emissions from the system as opposed to the curtailment level, the difference between adding those data centers and simply not adding them, because the data centers basically, your 70% of that much bigger demand is not as good as, the 70% of the existing demand in terms of emissions, because you've already added, even if you get to 70%, and even if you count that full 70% as decarbonised, that's still 30% extra carbonized energy that you've added to your system, well, potentially, of whatever that extra demand was. So I don't know, I've thrown a lot of things at you. You can comment or respond or not, but I do think it was an excellent piece of work.
Yeah, there's a few kind of, I would say, actually quite good points in there. Maybe to tackle the point on curtailment first. So yeah, I agree with you on the point that, it could be that the overall best solution is actually to allow a little bit more curtailment on the system. If the wind is cheap enough and you can put more of it on and kind of get more renewables in the system, and the solution to preventing the curtailment is more expensive than just building more of it and taking it, that is something that could also be explored. And actually for the 2040, when we're trying to get to a 100% RESI scenario, the final mitigation solution that we had to employ because we ran out of ideas was exactly that. We let the curtailment get a little bit higher, and that got us to our 100% renewable target. That'll be kind of in the final report. So that's maybe to that point. I certainly take the point. It's curtailment is only a bad thing if it's not optimal. So that's maybe point number one. To the point on the decarbonisation, like certainly that is the objective. I just don't have the figures exactly on the top of my head, but it is in the Bringa study if you go through it. This does actually reduce emissions from the electricity sector very, very substantially, even with demand going up. So there is a massive decarbonisation benefit to a 70% RESE system. And the other quick point on the data centres is I'm not too sure, are we going to tell the world to stop generating data? But I would say we should certainly be focusing on trying to make that, like, I think if we don't figure out how to decouple demand for electricity from the growth in demand for data at some point in the next decade, we are going to have a big problem because the growth of data is exponential, and I don't think we can afford to have exponential growth in demand for electricity. So somewhere along the line, in terms of efficiency of data centers, we need to decouple those two things. But I come back to the point I made at the beginning. If you can take a huge amount of carbon from the electricity sector and it doesn't cost you anything extra, I think that's no regrets.
Just the one comment I would make on the data center thing, and it's only one example of demand growth. We could look at other examples. It happens to be particularly in focus in Ireland. To me, the prudent thing is to add that after we decarbonise, not before. So, if in 20 years' time we've got a zero carbon electricity system, fill your boots, have all the data you want, but don't roll out the data while you're still scratching your head figuring out how to decarbonise.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I'm not sure how. I think at a global level as well, you have to think about, if we're not doing it here in a country where it can be done more efficiently than some other countries in terms of the climate, and it gets done somewhere else, it is a point. I'm just not quite sure what you would do to stop that while we figure out the answer, but it is a point. Yeah.
When I'm president of the world,
the benign dictatorship we need. Yeah.
Hello, Jerry Duggan, Irish Academy of Engineering. I think what we heard this evening was an extremely insightful and very well researched piece of work. One of the best I've seen for quite some time, and very much appreciated. I think it's not the end, it is the start, because where we have to go from here is start putting money sums associated with each of the options. And the second thing is, not alone do we have to cost them, we have to determine who will pay for them. Because one of the reasons wind energy or the wind industry is so attracted to interconnectors is they believe somebody else will pay for them. Whereas in looking, and I was surprised at the figures, at increasing the capacity factor of wind farms, then the wind industry pays. And I would have thought the easiest way to incentivize the wind industry was in fact curtailment. So effectively say, if you don't do it, you'll be curtailed, rather than saying we'll give you money. Now, the second point I would make is the Academy of Engineering has calculated that reaching the 70% target by 2030 will require an investment in the electricity sector of well in excess of 20 billion. Data centres accounting for something between 6 and 9 billion of that. And to give you an indication, Barry, with 70% electricity, and based on the current projections for data centres will add 1.5 million tonnes a year to Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. Bill Gates, when he was in town recently, spoke to his staff and he said it wasn't well known that Ireland had 1% of the European population and 30% of the data centre capacity. So I think, unfortunately, Barry, the horse is bolted at this stage. If you just look at the sheer number of them, they're like rosary beads around North Dublin over as far as Tala. They're there and they're going to use energy. And this is something we need to look at. A question I have is, okay, the Bringa report, which you referenced a number of times, firstly, it was based on the 2017 generation capacity statement because of the timing. The 2018 generation capacity statement had an awful lot higher demand because of data center projections. The second thing is it assumed a 35% capacity factor for onshore wind. To date, I've seen no evidence that that figure will be reached, and I'm just wondering if you'd care to comment on that. And the final thing is, there was no mention of money in it. Now, you mentioned there what the break-even points for renewable generation is, but also the Parsons-Brinkhoff study referenced there, produced for the Department of Climate Action, etc., envisages capital costs much higher than are currently obtaining elsewhere. And unfortunately, our cost of developments in Ireland have been very much higher than elsewhere. So there are a series of issues here, but I think the study you've done provides an excellent start point for some serious analytical work that we need to do before we commit to 20 billion expenditure.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Maybe to answer the capacity factor question first. I mean, obviously, as you deploy the newer technologies with larger rotors, certainly, like I work day to day developing wind farm projects, and we would certainly expect to be well in excess of 35% on a lot of our future projects. And so when we're looking at the 2030 figure, it's the blended fleet capacity factor. So today in Ireland, the blended fleet is about 30. But the expectation is that that will rise a lot as you have offshore wind in the mix with very, very high capacity factors, and with the capacity factor of projects I work on today are far, far in excess of that with the newer technologies. So that would be maybe a point on the capacity factors. To the general point on costs, I would say, like, I'm familiar with the study you referred to from the department. That would not tally at all with what I would see in my day-to-day work in terms of where price points will be. I mean, obviously, I can't speak to exactly where Quailshire will be bidding, but certainly the expectation within the market, it would be very, very far south, and we would. I think there will be an expectation in industry, and if you looked at our markets as well, you're certainly seeing it, that we will be able to beat the figures that are in the Bringa study, and maybe by quite some distance. And you're seeing as well in the UK offshore sector. And like I've no commercial interest at all in offshore, but you are seeing offshore prices coming down, onshore prices coming down. Ireland historically has been a little bit expensive, and I would say like our grid connection costs in Ireland are probably a little bit above the norm, but the capital costs actually become very, very much less significant when you go to these large turbine technologies with huge energy productions from them. Those kinds of projects can tolerate a lot more cost and generate at a low price. And I can't, off the top of my head, I haven't got the total tally of how much you have to spend to get there, but it's actually more about the cost of energy. So it might be it's a very, very different system when you've got a system with lots of capital intensive project but very low cost of generation, versus a system where it's got maybe lower capital costs but much more operational costs. So yeah, like my expectation certainly is that when you take it back to the cost of energy, and ultimately that's what's important to consumers, what they have to pay for their energy. I think in the not too distant future, I suspect the first res auction might still be a little bit higher because we're still, it's legacy projects that were consented some years ago. But the next generation of projects that are coming, I think you're going to see some very, very low prices in auctions that will make the whole commercial story stack up a lot better. But I don't disagree with you. This study didn't tackle that. The Bringa study tackled it to some extent, but it's certainly, as we start seeing, as things evolve, I think we have to monitor the cost of, let's call it the 70% project as we progress. Like it is important. Yeah.
Hi there. I just have one last quick question. Great study between. You mentioned the heat pumps as a possible, and the cylinders, hot water cylinders as a possible storage mechanism. Just wondering, was there any consideration given to the hot water cylinders from an immersion technology with around 700,000 homes in Ireland? That might be a very much quick win and for especially rural Ireland as well.
Actually in this we didn't model that, but it is. I've spoken to a few people who have been doing a bit of work in that space, and I think it is a quick win if you can do it. Like, because if the flexibility is extremely cheap, then even if the impact isn't massive, it doesn't. Like you're talking maybe to the earlier point, like there's a lot of cost here, and if you can come up with a cheap way of injecting a bit of flexibility.
Exactly. Smart technology.
Exactly. Because it's very, very low cost. So yeah, and like that's what I was saying. We were a bit conscious as well that we were kind of saying a little bit about what some of these technologies don't do very well. We really want to emphasize there's very much a role for demand side management. There's very much a role for storage, and if you can come up with kind of neat, cheap, quick solutions like that, they're very valuable.
There's a project there that was carried out there, and I was involved in it recently as well. It was residential demand response, and it was with AirGrid as well. So there's a few probably tricks there that you might look into.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to wrap it up because I think we've gone over time. But just on behalf of the division, I just want to thank Paul and the team, obviously, behind that has been involved in this. Congratulate you on a fantastic piece of work. And, we talked about the challenge to get to 70%. Like you said, we have to start rolling up our sleeves, but what a way to start. I mean, this is a really great piece of work that frames the problem and helps us to get on the road towards a solution. So I'd like if everyone could just show their appreciation. And just to say that we have our lectures first Wednesday of the month, and keep an eye on the website, or if you're on the email list, you'll get the details of the upcoming lectures. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to all those who joined on the live stream.